Chapter 15. Asa's Will. Nancy Drew has never forgotten that weird, wild day at the Twisted Candles, although she had had far more thrilling experiences before and more exciting adventures since. The frail body of the century-old inventor was gently carried out of the room which had been his whole world for years, and taken to the city for the brief interval before burial. Before that had been done, the relatives began to arrive. Peter Boonton and his nieces, the mothers of Bess Marvin and George Fane, Jacob Sidney and some stranger to whom he referred pointedly as his legal adviser. Carson Drew, however, had taken his stand like a sentry at the door to Asa's room and allowed no one to enter. In the course of the morning, a deputy from the sheriff's court arrived in response to Mr. Drew's summons and affixed a seal to the door of the tower room. Poor Sadie was heartbroken. She had literally and actually lost her best friend in all the world, and sincere grief at the old man's departure was strengthened by the girl's anticipation of the empty, hard-working days and years before her. Nancy did all she could to comfort Sadie, telling her that Mr. Drew had practically promised to find out the secret of her ancestry and pledging herself to visit Sadie often and to have the girl spend weeks at her home. Nancy, you see, knew what it meant to lose friendship, and her heart still ached at the estrangement with Bess and George. All interest, of course, centered upon Mr. Drew. The relatives pleaded and threatened, wept and scolded for a chance to enter Asa Sidney's room just to pick up a small keepsake. Peter Boonton and Jacob Sidney waited their opportunities to speak to Mr. Drew privately, trying to learn what was in Mr. Sidney's will. "I must comply with the law and with the ethics of my profession," was Mr. Drew's only response to all questions. He did, however, have a longer conversation with the Semmets. "You are held responsible for that room," he told them. "If that seal is broken, you will be arrested. The windows are also locked and sealed, so there is an additional responsibility to see that no one climbs in through them. Do you understand?" Awestruck, the two Semmets pledged themselves to keep the chamber undisturbed. At last, Mr. Drew called all the relatives together and asked them to agree upon funeral plans. Nobody seemed very much concerned over the disposal of Asa Sidney's mortal remains, and it was swiftly decided to hold private ceremonies and inter the body in the River Heights Cemetery, after Mr. Drew assured them that there were funds available in cash to pay the expenses. "Then we will meet here in 3 days to open the will," Mr. Drew said. "First, it must be filed for probate in the county court. Shall we agree to a meeting at this place 3 days hence at 2:00 in the afternoon?" "If that's the earliest, all right," Peter Boonton assented grumblingly. Nancy at first entertained the idea of asking Sadie to her home for the 3 days, and then decided it would be far better if the girl remained to keep a watchful eye on the premises. "You will do that, won't you, Sadie?" Nancy asked, and the girl nodded her tearful promise. "I hope Mr. Sidney left the house to the Semmets, though," she said. "It is the only home I ever knew, and it is full of memories of his kindness to me. I should like to remain here, where I can see you often, Nancy." "No one knows what is in the will but my father," Nancy replied. "But I am pretty sure that Mr. Sidney made some provision for you, Sadie. He seemed to love you too much not to remember you in some way or other." When she drove her father home later in the day, Nancy commented with distaste on the greed shown by the relatives. "Most of them are pretty nice folks," she said sadly. "Mrs. Fane and Mrs. Marvin have always been kind to me, and are as pleasant women as you would care to meet. They seemed entirely different persons today. It is certainly tragic what changes in a person's character can be made by competition for money, especially unearned money, Mr. Drew commented. When this is all forgotten and the persons can become their natural selves again, the petty meanness and jealousy will vanish again into the secret depths of their minds, perhaps forever. It is something we must all guard against in ourselves. On each of the intervening days before the reading of the will, Nancy found opportunity to drive to the Twisted Candles, first to see Sadie, and secondly to examine the sealed door to convince herself it had not been tampered with. On the last day, she encountered Peter Boonton on the grounds talking to a stranger. "We could cut the place up into 60 building lots," Boonton was saying. "We will sell half to raise money enough to develop the rest and build cottages and roads. Where the old house stands, I plan to put up a modern gasoline station." Then he saw Nancy and abruptly shut his jaws with a click and led the real estate broker away. "Counting his chickens before they are hatched," Nancy mused. "He seems very certain of getting the property." At last, the day arrived when all interested persons met at the Twisted Candles for the reading of the will. They assembled in one of the ground-floor dining rooms. George and Bess were there, nodding wistful greetings to Nancy, but staying close to their parents. Mr. Drew directed that the Semmets were to be present. Nancy went to hunt for Sadie, who was too grief-stricken to appear. Mrs. Semmet told her where the girl's room was, and Nancy, accustomed to her own tastefully furnished room, with its tinted walls, its attractive drapes, its desk and easy chair and pleasant pictures, was shocked at the cell-like severity of Sadie's bedchamber. It was a tiny room at one end of the second-floor hall, with one window. The walls were painted an ugly, shiny green. A straight-backed chair, an iron bed with some of the white enamel chipped off, and a varnished pine dresser completed the furnishings. Sadie had made fluffy curtains for the one window and had pinned up gaily colored magazine covers as an attempt at decoration. Sadie herself was lying on the bed, her eyes swollen from tears, when Nancy entered. She demurred at first, against joining the expectant circle downstairs. "You must come, Sadie," Nancy urged. "My father said you would have to be present. I am sure that means Mr. Sidney left you something in his will." "I hope he gave me his old easy chair, the one in which he loved to sit at the window," Sadie choked. She dashed some cold water from the pitcher into her eyes, smoothed her plain dress, and permitted Nancy to lead her downstairs. Sadie took a seat at the edge of the circle of whispering relatives, her eyes downcast in shyness. Nancy stood behind her, patting the girl comfortingly on the shoulder. "We have met," Mr. Drew began to address the group, "to read the last will and testament of Asa Sidney. The document was written only a week ago, in his own hand and in duplicate. The original is filed in the courthouse, and I hold the copy here. They have been carefully compared and found to be exact duplicates. The will was witnessed by Mr. Raymond Hill, Executive Vice President of the Smith's Ferry Bank. I preface the reading of these papers with these remarks because some of its provisions may surprise you. I may add that, although I am named executor of the estate, I had never met nor even heard of Mr. Sidney 24 hours before I was summoned by him to help draw up this document." There was a stir in the group and a sudden hum of voices, which was quickly hushed as Mr. Drew opened a bulky envelope and unfolded some crisp sheets of paper. "Mr. Hill, will you identify this testament?" the banker, who had been sitting unnoticed in one corner, arose, examined the papers, and nodded. "That is my signature," he said, "and those are my initials on each sheet. This is the document which Mr. Sidney prepared and which I witnessed." "This identification is not legally necessary," Mr. Drew added. "I requested it for a special purpose." "Hurry up with the reading and cut out the fancy business," Jacob Sidney called out. Mr. Drew shot him a level look. Then he began to read while everyone, Sadie excepted, leaned forward tensely. "I, Asa Sidney, being of sound mind, although in the 101st year of my life, do declare this to be my last will and testament, prepared by my own hand, legally witnessed. The property which I wish disposed of after my death, according to the terms stated hereinafter, is as follows." Nancy listened sharply as her father read off a long list of items, striving to memorize each one. True, she knew she could easily obtain a copy of the list from her parent, but the best place to keep the record was safely engraved upon her brain. The house, with 400 acres of surrounding land, headed the list. Then came the full legal description of another piece of real estate in River Heights, a place Nancy instantly recognized as being in the heart of the business district and consequently very valuable. 2 bank accounts were mentioned, each containing over $1,000, and also some shares in a building and loan company. The bank books and receipts are included in the contents of a black wooden chest, bound in brass, upon the lid of which is my name in my own hand. Mr. Drew read, "The chest is in my room. Also in my room," Nancy gasped, "the ebony box, the one Semet had buried." She cast a quick look in the innkeeper's direction and saw that he was looking stiffly out of the window, in the direction of the shed. Lists of bonds and bank shares were tabulated in the will, and hoards of gold coin were referred to as being in one box or another, or in a drawer in some old desk or other piece of furniture. "I do hereby direct," Mr. Drew read in a voice suddenly a note or two louder, "that each of my descendants, namely Jacob Sidney, Peter Boonton, Anna Boonton Marvin and her daughter Bess Marvin, Louise Boonton Fane and her daughter George Fane, as well as the young woman known as Sadie Whipple, shall each select by mutual consent and in the order named 1 article of furniture from my belongings as a permanent keepsake." "Oh, Nancy, he didn't forget me," Sadie breathed. "Perhaps nobody will want that old easy chair, and I may be allowed to keep it." "Excepting," continued Mr. Drew with emphasis, "that all my candle molds and models for candles, lighting devices, lamps, and so forth, and all the candles shall first be destroyed under the supervision of Carson Drew, my legal adviser, who is hereby declared executor of the estate without bond, and excepting the portrait of my late and beloved, although estranged wife, which will be disposed of hereinafter. I then direct that all my other property, real and personal, be converted into cash by legal sale at the best possible price within 30 days after my death, and the money thus realized is to be divided into 9 equal parts." At this, everyone sat up straight again, and calculating looks were exchanged among the possible heirs. "1 share shall again be divided into 7 equal parts," Mr. Drew continued solemnly, and the now bewildered heirs sat further forward on their chairs. "1 of these shares, that is, 1/63 of the entire estate, shall be given to Frank Semet and his wife Emma, in consideration of those years during which they served me honestly and well. 1 each of the remaining sub-shares, namely 1/63 of the entire estate, shall be given to each of my relatives, namely Jacob Sidney, Peter Boonton, Anna Marvin, Bess Marvin, Louise Fane, and George Fane. All the rest of the money, to wit, 8/9 of the cash proceeds of the estate, shall be given to the girl known as Sadie Whipple, who shall also inherit the portrait of my wife." A concerted growl arose from the disappointed heirs. "Quick, a glass of water!" Nancy cried. "Sadie has fainted." End of chapter 15.